to bring reinforcements in to establish law and order.
And if that means bring our National Guard in for presence, then so be it, because we got to do something. Children are dying.
One of the reasons that the three dumbest words in modern politics were defund the police is because you go to any high crime area anywhere in the country, and the people who are living there want policing the most. Good policing, legal policing, compassionate policing. But the idea of anything it takes to make us safer is going to resonate there. And that's misunderstood in our politics, and it's misunderstood about the story of Chicago. I don't like hearing about Chicago all the time from the right because they don't adjust their policies to help those populations. But they aren't wrong to point out that there's plenty of shooting and killing right there. This weekend in Chicago, 58 shot, 8 dead. And for the governor there, Pritzker, who I think's got a lot of political horsepower and potential, to say, leave us alone, we've got this handled, makes you look like you're not just defending the status quo, you're defending crime. Okay? And that is this moment that the president, by his wit or by fortune or by randomness, has stumbled on probably the biggest cultural issue of the moment. What are we going to do about crime? Everybody cares about it. I want to bring in one of the leading voices in the conservative movement, author of a new book, Lions and Scavengers. It says Avengers in my prompter, but I won't be tricked. Lions and Scavengers, the true story of America, Ben Shapiro. It's good to have you here. Thank you for taking the opportunity. Congratulations on the success and the book. Who are the lions? Who are the scavengers?
So the basic idea, I think, is that lions are people who are dutiful, who want to build things, who believe that they actually have a role to play, an active role to play in making their own lives and the lives of people around them better. And scavengers are people who look at all the problems that they have and they blame that on the system. Then the idea is that the system has to be torn down. And I'm not sure that, it's about individuals as a whole falling into lions versus scavengers. Some do, some don't. Or even civilizations, some are more lion-esque, some are more scavenger-like. But even within every individual human being, you have to wake up in the morning and decide whether to be active in your own life, whether to be a person who makes the world around you better, the society around you stronger, who makes your family and your community better, or whether you're the kind of person who is going to look at all the problems in your life, externalize those, blame the system, and then unify with others to tear down all of the institutions that have allowed you freedom and success. And I think that you've seen across the West particularly the rise in what I call in the book the coalition of scavengers, people who really have nothing in common except that they hate the systems, and the systems must be torn to the ground. They don't even know necessarily what they're going to build afterward. The thing they know is that all the things that are going wrong in their life are wrongs that are done to them. They are the oppressed. They've been exploited. And the only way to fix things is first to tear everything down.
So ordinarily, I would have said, oh, yeah, that's a straight play for Shapiro because I ascribe those motivations to the far fringes of the left. But now, that's like MAGA mantra that you just said. We got to tear down all the institutions. It's all got to die, burn it down, drain the swamp, deep state. I mean, this is the rhetoric of the right, not the left.
Well, I mean, I think it's the rhetoric of both, meaning I think that there's a lot of that on the left. I think if you look at Zoran Mamdani, for example, in New York, talking about what he wants to do in New York, it's very much along those lines. And then there certainly is sort of...
Why is it working, by the way?
Because I think that there are a lot of people, particularly in New York, who've been made dependent on government largesse and government regulations and government programs that are already in his category. And then they look at all the problems and they say, well, let's hand it to somebody who promises to fix all of that easily. Right? The only I can solve aspect to our politics, again, this runs across the gamut. This is really not a right-left divide.
Because that is literally what the president said during his first campaign was only I can fix it.
And I think Barack Obama said similar things. Joe Biden has said similar things. It's become a really terrible hallmark of American politics for politicians to come along and say, you've got problems in your life. Those problems are not your problems. Those problems are things that I personally am going to solve by restructuring all the institutions. And so I think that, what a conservative traditionally would say, the sort of G.K. Chesterton conservative would say...
Wrote the book Orthodoxy.
That when you're walking through a field and you see a fence, if you don't know why the fence is there, if you're a conservative, you first have to discover why the fence is there before you decide to remove it. And the sort of traditionally non-conservative move is you see the fence, you don't know why it's there, and you just uproot it without any further thought. And I think that we've become, unfortunately, addicted to sort of uprooting things without thinking about why that's there first. Now, that doesn't mean that every institution deserves to survive. Some really are corrupted. There are things out there that are bad and that need to be fixed. But the sort of unthinking belief that everything needs to be torn down, even the great institutions of America, even the most basic things, family, church, the checks and balances of the American government. You tear all these things down, you're going to find yourself in a world of hurt afterward.
does put you a little bit of odds with your side of the spectrum, which is part of the problem with binary politics, as you're identifying, is that it's all gotten exaggerated. It's all fringe. The conversation you were listening to up at the top, generations past, the idea of, well, yeah, let's have a discussion about what the data says and where there are gaps and where there aren't and what do we learn, what was good, what was bad. That was a no-brainer. You would have done that in due course. Now we avoid it like the plague. Nobody's even covering this story tonight. Well, only me.
I think one of the things that was fascinating there is listening to Dr. Bhattacharya, who actually was victimized by Dr. Fauci, who actually tried to shut down dissemination of his Great Barrington Declaration, which was an alternative strategy for addressing the pandemic by essentially allowing healthier populations to tranche back into the population. Even if they were going to get COVID, they weren't really going to suffer from it. It would move through the population faster. Dr. Fauci really pushed back behind the scenes against the dissemination of that. That's probably why Dr. Bhattacharya is now at the head of NIH. But Dr. Bhattacharya is not saying we need to dissolve NIH. He's saying we need to fix NIH. And I think that is a better approach in the most successful country in the history of the world, is to look at the institutions and say, how do we fix these? How do we correct these? Now, again, there may be institutions that are so thoroughly destroyed that basically noting that they're dead is just being the coroner, not the killer. But we have to be very careful about how we address these things.
Fixing is hard.
Yes.
Breaking is easy. Saying broken is easiest, right? I think we see that playing out in crime right now. I would even suggest it a little bit with the populists on the left, that just as was true with MAGA, which was misunderstood and disrespected, the grievance is real. They are right to complain about what they're complaining about on the right during MAGA, culturally driven, but economically. On the left now, affordability. They're right about what's wrong, but they are wrong about how to make it right. And that's what I see with the crime also. I think the president is having a genius moment of focusing on this. Presidents don't usually mess with local crime because it's a local problem. I don't think the military is the right fix. But the Democrats are spending time saying this is proof he's a despot. That's who brings in the military. This is a banana republic. Instead of saying, hey, work with them, but not with the military. Here's what you asked for. Yes. Better ideas.
I mean, it is sort of astonishing. The president does have a genius for getting his opponents to take the 20 side of every 80-20 issue. And the president will say, no men in women's sports. And almost reflexively, you'll see people on the left say, no, that can't be. We must allow men in women's sports. Or the president will say, crime in Baltimore is really bad. And people say, really? How dare you say that crime in Baltimore... I mean, crime in Baltimore is not good. And so the opponents of President Trump have been essentially handing him victory after victory, particularly during his second term, by immediately assuming that the American public are going to take the opposite side of whatever issue he decides to take on. And that's wrong. I mean, I think the reason that he won the last election cycle is because he actually grabbed the moderate middle. If you took a look positionally at where President Trump was on nearly every issue in the last election cycle, he was much closer to the moderate middle than Kamala Harris was, actually.
Why? Because the incumbent has to own the status quo. So Biden/Harris were positioned to have to do one of two things. Really brave, which say we didn't get it done, but we can the next time. We were coming out of it and it was hard. Or defend everything that is. And that gave President Trump, or at that time, former President Trump, an opportunity to grab the reality that people weren't happy with the status quo. Here I am with Ben Shapiro, author of the new book, Lions and Scavengers, The True Story of America. He just said he's a lion, I'm a scavenger. I was about to attack him, but he's got like 10 guys here, so I left it alone. Ben, congratulations on the book. Thank you for being with us. What do you think about what we're doing here, and how does it change how you used to view what I was doing?
I mean, I think that you've really done a courageous job of moving away from what I assumed were your political priors over at CNN. I think that CNN obviously was pushing people in a particular direction in the hosting channel, toward a much more left-wing viewpoint. That's what the entire network seemed to be. And I think that you've gone admirably independent here, I have to say. It's pretty cool.
What do you make of the challenge of the fact that the middle is death, cooperation is death, accommodation is death, nuance is death? You have to be all in, one side or the other. It's the only way to get paid. It's the only way to get heard.
I mean, I'm not sure that that's true. And the reason I say that's not true, it may be true in the short term. I'm not sure that it's true in the long term. I think that, there's always the hot thing of the moment. The reality is that the number of people generally in America who engage in politics on enough of a granular level, they're watching you every night or listening to me every day, that's a small percentage of the population. And the difference is between, your ratings and somebody else's ratings, it's a rounding error when you're looking at the American population. So, we're all in this industry looking very hard at those numbers, but I think that we have to realize that when you go out and touch grass and sort of the broad spectrum of how Americans behave with one another, as I encourage a lot of people, just sometimes turn off the TV, turn off the internet, go talk to people in your community, go to church, actually hang out with actual human beings, and what you'll see is there's a lot more independence out there than there is on the internet.
What is the biggest difference between Ben Shapiro today and Ben Shapiro 5-7 years ago?
I think I've been pretty consistent in my principles, actually, so I won't say that I've changed a lot in terms of my principles. I think older and wiser is one thing, a little bit more considered in probably how I make my arguments, because I want to make sure that I'm using as many of the correct words as I can. Doesn't mean I won't make mistakes, but I will say that I'm one of the only commentators that I've ever heard of who has like a running list on their website of all the mistakes and dumb things I think I've ever said, where I try to explain them or apologize for them if I think that I've done something wrong. And so I think if you're not getting better at your job over the course of time, then you're not doing it right. And I've been doing this since I was 17 years old. I'm now 41, so I can't claim to be a youngster anymore. Right? I have 4 kids ranging from 2 to 11. And so as you get older, you try to be a little more careful with your words because you're running out of time to say them. So,
did you ever think that you'd be in the position where you are now, where it is dangerous for you to have a yarmulke on your head?
I don't want to overstate that danger because, again, this is the greatest country in the world for Jews. It's an amazing, amazing country. And I'm lucky to be able to live and work in this country. Obviously, I've lived here all my life. My family goes all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. They got here in like 1903, 1904. And it's an amazing country. And so saying that you can't walk down the street, I think that's an exaggeration. Not in certain places. In certain places, it's not. The fact that you have seen rising anti-Semitism on the left and also on sort of the horseshoe theory, right? It's deeply troubling. And again, I think it does speak to a conspiratorial view of the world that I talk about in the book as the scavenger mentality, this idea that there is this sort of shadowy group that's running all of the levers of power. And that's the reason why I'm not getting what I want. That's the reason why the world isn't constructed the way I want it to be. And the reality is that the sort of biblical worldview, and I think the Western worldview, is predicated generally on the notion that in a free country, which America is, if you've got a problem in your life, you should first look in the mirror and determine whether you can fix that problem before you say that it's the Constitution of the United States or some shadowy, unnamed group behind the scenes pulling all the strings. Because in all likelihood, that's nonsense. And there's a difference between conspiracies, which exist and there's evidence for, and conspiracy theories where people are just asking questions. I've ripped on my show on these sort of just asking questions. The job is to ask questions in order to seek answers. If you're just asking questions and any evidence that comes in is of no consequence to you, you're not doing your job and you're not really asking questions. You're positing a theory, but you don't have the courage of your convictions.
The real problem for me is the manifestation of gotcha. That I'm going to take one little thing and I'm going to twist it to make it everything. And it'll usually play to fear. And that's why I have been playing, and I understand that there's a sensitivity issue with it. I want the insensitivity, which is, I thought Jews control the media. If Jews control the media, why are you losing the media battle over the war in the Middle East? And I did not think, do I think this is the greatest country in the world for Jews? It's probably second after Israel, and that's because all the other ones suck, because I hear people all the time saying things to people who have yarmulkes on, an open demonstration of their faith as Orthodox, killer. I've never heard that before.
I will say, it's a unique time. It for sure is. I mean, I didn't have to think about this sort of stuff. I think it gets worse. I would be surprised if
I don't think the war ends. I think it gets worse, and I think it plays into the midterms.
So I think actually very little of this has to do with the war. I think the war was a triggering event, but I don't think that the underlying sentiment is really due to the war as much as it is to a rising mentality that, again, has been played up by politicians and commentators on both sides, that somehow the world is screwing you and there is a secret exploiter class who's making your life miserable, and the people who are disproportionately successful in the United States must be the people who are responsible for your plight. And that's always an easy political play. And by the way, I don't think restricted to Jews. I think that you're seeing it in some areas being blamed on, for example, Indians, right? And I think that's a manifestation of the same sort of sentiment. In other countries, it's blamed on what Thomas Sowell called like middlemen Chinese, in minority Chinese, in countries where Chinese are not the majority, and they end up being sort of economic middlemen. So it's not a rarity in world history, but I think it is rearing its ugly head right now.
What is the defining issue that will make the biggest difference in American life in the near term?
I mean, the number one issue is whether we are going to be grateful or envious. And that really is a sole problem. Are we going to be grateful for the great gift that we have in America and what we've been given and what the freedom and the prosperity and the private property and the equality before the law? Or are we going to be so envious of one another that we decide to basically destroy this whole thing? And you can see the meltdown happening. I mean, really. And I think you were talking before about that pendulum politics. I use the same sort of metaphor all the time. The fact that our politics is swinging so wildly right now that every sin of the other side justifies that sin on my side, but a little more so. That spells doom. I mean, that really is a death spiral. At some point, there's going to have to be a group of people, right, left, and center. And I don't really care where you are politically as much as I care where you are in terms of your soul. What are you going to do to make the country stronger? Are you going to weave better social fabric? Are you going to defend the fundamental principles of the civilization? Are you going to take risks and innovate and live with the downside of risks if you fail without blaming the system? If you do all those things, America will thrive. If you don't do those things and you decide instead that the system is to blame, you're going to wreck the country. And that we are the last best hope of humanity. So if we go, it's going to get real bad.
I think the key for us is to remember the messiness of the experiment. And the reason I say conversation is the cure is not because it's alliterative, although that helps, but because it doesn't matter that you and I disagree about the answer. If it's fundamental, this person is not equal to me, we're going to have a problem. If it's about the best way to do things and you and I disagree that this is the wrong fix, that's not the issue. The issue is how we disagree about it and how I make it personal about you and I say things about you. It's not allowed on the floor of Congress. It's not allowed in court. It's not allowed in any real officiated debate setting, and there are reasons for that. And I think the more we get back to that, you are always welcome here. We may well not agree about things. You may not like it. I may not like it, but how we handle it is everything. And you're welcome here for the conversation.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Ben Shapiro, good luck with the book. Best to the family.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.